Okay, hello and welcome. Today we have Imogen Dalziel as part of our exhibition joining us for this conversation. Thank you, Imogen, for joining us. So Dr. Imogen Dalziel is a part-time program coordinator for the UK's Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnerships. She's a part-time administrator for the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London, and a freelance Holocaust educator and researcher. She completed her PhD in 2020 with a thesis focused on the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum's adaptation to the digital museum. The primary research interests concern Holocaust tourism, digital Holocaust memory, and the overlap between these two aspects. So welcome again, Imogen. Thanks so much for agreeing to talk to us. So I suppose, you know, one of the things I thought was we have a kind of a conversation about some of the questions that has come out in connected to our exhibition, and also in connection to your work that I have had a chance to read. So I'll ask some questions and maybe some follow-up questions, and then we'll see how it goes. Is that okay?
Sounds fine, thank you.
Okay, thanks. So you work on what is known as Holocaust tourism or dark tourism, as we read out in on your bio. So can you tell us a little bit more about what is meant by that?
Dark tourism is kind of an umbrella term which was first widely written about by two scholars, John Lennon and Malcolm Foley, in a book which came out about 20 years ago. And in that case, dark tourism refers to tourism visiting places associated with mass murder or murder, with tragedy. Sometimes this can be for entertainment purposes. So, for example, in a British context, we might talk about a visit to the London dungeons, which looks at British history and the kind of more macabre aspects, such as the plague, the Black Death, Jack the Ripper, and so on, but in an entertaining way. So it can kind of take that form. But otherwise, dark tourism is a kind of, as I say, overarching category for other types, of which Holocaust tourism is one. And the way I would define that is tourism to sites where the Holocaust took place, whether that was the industrialized mass murder of the Jewish people and other persecuted groups, persecuted by the Nazis and their collaborators, or former ghettos. In some cases, these are linked also to trips to Jewish cemeteries, although arguably they're kind of evolving into their own kind of Jewish cultural trips as well. So my primary focus is on Holocaust tourism in the context of the former Nazi camps, particularly in relation to what is now the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. Okay,
thank you. Yeah, in that context, I've read your work on why people photograph Auschwitz. As many agree, is the largest graveyard on earth. Why photograph this very difficult site? Can you tell us a bit about why people photograph?
I think one thing to bear in mind, in a sense, is even though Auschwitz is, as you say, essentially the largest graveyard on earth, it doesn't appear as a graveyard. If we think about kind of what a cemetery or a graveyard looks like, it's a little bit more removed. It's almost a little bit more abstract than that. So there is really one mass grave, a Soviet prisoner of war grave in Auschwitz-Birkenau, but that isn't really something that many people see. It's quite hidden away. You have to sort of know where it is. Otherwise, what you're left with are the ruins of the former camp, the barracks, the ruins of the gas chambers, and so on. So in that sense, perhaps people don't always see it through that lens, even though we know essentially what that's what it is. So there are quite a few reasons why people take photographs. I suppose in sticking with the idea of a cemetery of commemoration, then that's one aspect. So people find it, they kind of find comfort perhaps in taking photographs to commemorate the victims, to remember the dead. There are lots of examples of people who take pictures of flowers that have been left, for example, or memorial stones that visitors leave, which is a kind of a Jewish sign of commemoration, to leave a stone at a grave, for example. There are other reasons, sort of educationally. So I've spoken to people who wanted to show friends and family, or perhaps school students back home, what they'd seen and how things look. And the vastness of the site is one, because particularly Auschwitz-Birkenau is a huge site, almost stretches kind of beyond the eye kind of when you're there and you first enter under the gate. There are also more complex reasons. For example, kind of the idea of being sympathetic or perhaps even empathetic with victims, with people who arrived in Auschwitz. So particularly in Birkenau, I've seen people taking pictures from the train tracks and kind of almost trying to imagine what it would have been like, which is very problematic, because for those of us who weren't there, we simply can't imagine these things and can't relive that experience in any way. There are also photographs that have been taken on a more aesthetic level. So people that I spoke to for my research quite freely admitted that they took photographs because they thought they looked good. You know, there was a good framing, or there was something interesting, something that caught their eye, which on the surface might seem quite shallow. But if we think about it more sort of to try and interpret that, then, you know, sometimes it's a case of being able to put a distance between yourself and the thing that you're witnessing and that you're seeing. And of course, Auschwitz is kind of full of the evidence of the crimes, of the mass murder, some very difficult objects to look at. So prosthetic limbs are one example, shoes and eyeglasses and so on. And so sometimes when we hear someone trying to take good pictures, it sounds, again, superficial, but that's one of the reasons. And then perhaps the last reason that I would say is also to the iconicity of the site. So the fact that the gates, the Arbeit macht frei gate in Auschwitz I, and then the larger brick so-called gate of death in Birkenau, these are globally recognized images, and have become what we might call icons in their own right. And so a lot of the time people are taking pictures of them, or things like the barbed wire, the barracks and so on, because they recognize those. And for them, it's kind of a confirmation that they've been there and they've seen this, and they want their own photograph of that to kind of confirm their own presence. So there are lots of different reasons why people take photographs. And I think it's easy to look at it, again, to kind of be a little bit wary of people doing this, and maybe they're snapping mindlessly. But the research that I've done shows that actually people really do have reasons and motivations behind them.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is interesting. It's also very sharp in a sense, the point you said, that it is, the question of representation about it, right? Like, how far can we imagine the real site of Auschwitz, which was this industrial killing factory, which was the most atrocious site where humanity almost proved it can annihilate itself. At that level of cruelty of humans against humans. So and currently there stands this museum, right? So we see the site and its history and try to connect it through that museum, isn't it? There's the question of representation, that there is a serious limit to which one can really experience original Auschwitz at all, right? All that we can do is to connect it through that museum. So in some sense, the whole place is kind of a liminal space. It kind of provides an entry into things based on what you take there, right? When based on what you bring there when you go and visit will in many ways influence your own experience of what you actually are able to experience there. In some sense, personal histories, family histories, collective memories, generational memories, survivors on their particular memories, and so on and so forth. The 70th anniversary got a lot of survivors there, right? So what do you think about that idea of, what you take there yields what you get from there, in many sense, in that kind of trying to connect with the atrocity there?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the first thing I would say, when you were talking about the connection with the original Auschwitz, it's very important to point out that it is meant as a museum. It's not meant as a kind of recreation or reconstruction. There's nothing that's been built there. I mean, there are exhibitions, but they show the original artifacts. There's no there's no sense of trying to make people feel like what it would have been like, and the guides certainly don't kind of advocate that as well. It's very much, as you say, a representation, if you like, of the site, which, I mean, a lot of what was there originally has been preserved, which is not the case with lots of other former Nazi camps. So the extermination camps of places like Treblinka and Sobibor and Belzec were actually destroyed before the end of the war by the Nazis and their collaborators. So it's one of the only examples of a camp, and of its size, of course, that we have. So what you see, yes, as you say, is very much a representation rather than an attempt to connect with the original history of it. But I think it's very important that every individual's experience of what they see is shaped by what they bring to that kind of place, definitely. So again, there's Auschwitz, the history of Auschwitz is incredibly complicated and multi-layered for lots of different groups, for lots of different people. You know, it was originally a concentration camp. It then developed into a kind of hybrid extermination camp as well. You had Jewish people imprisoned, but also Soviet prisoner of war, Polish political prisoners, Roma and Sinti, disabled people, and so on and so on. So you can imagine how much these memories are kind of contested and almost sometimes wrestle with each other. And it's the same with the people who visit. So as you said, you obviously have survivors of the camp or survivors of the Holocaust more generally, who will visit with family or relatives and educational groups. You then have wider educational study visits. You have lots of school children who visit. Before the pandemic, I was working with a charity called the Holocaust Educational Trust, which works nationwide in the UK. And we were taking sixth formers, kind of 16 to 18-year-olds, to the Auschwitz Museum, literally for the day, flying back to and from the UK in a day, and working with the museum to do that as well, to take them round. And so that's just one example. And we're now doing that online, but hopefully after things sort of settle down, we'll do that again. You also have, you know, it depends where people come from. So for example, you often get large groups of Israeli students who come to Poland. Originally, because it's quite a journey, and so they want to make the most of their time, they're often taken for a week or so. And originally these kind of trips were very much, they centered Poland, or what is now Poland, as a kind of Jewish graveyard. So they'd be taken from camp or former camp to former ghetto to Jewish cemetery. They didn't see Jewish culture and life as it is today, and that is changing. So they are now having more a cultural experience. But you would, see still lots of Israeli students who come, and kind of they're either all wearing kind of hoodies from their group or their school, and a lot of them, wrap their Israeli flag around themselves as they walk around. And then again, also you have people who come to the Auschwitz Museum because they've heard of it, because it's famous or infamous, perhaps. It's almost like a bit of a bucket list destination, if we can call it that. And you have people who, have a kind of few days in Krakow. And if you go into the city center in Krakow, you'll see there's lots and lots of tour operators offering visits to the museum, which can be combined with a visit to the Wieliczka salt mine nearby, which is another UNESCO site, and it's all very competitive, and so it's put in a context of tourism, of consumerism even. And that's not to say that people who go on those kind of trips are, not thinking about it or kind of, are doing it just because. But I think for a lot of people, that's the starting point. And as they arrive there and they walk through the museum, then they kind of appreciate more the history and get more of an understanding of it. So yes, there's lots of different factors, as with any visit to anywhere almost. It depends on the background, your family history, your nationality, your religion, and so on and so on, because the site of Auschwitz and the museum now means many different things to many different people.
Yeah, I mean, just coming back to the point on the representation, in fact, one of my very close friends visited the place and saw a large number of names which are of her family, extended and ancestral family, and that place has so many of her family members, ancestral family members perished, and it was she told me it was an extremely important experience in her whole life, and for a few days she couldn't talk, literally, and so in some sense, in an earlier conversation, you mentioned about this idea of post-witness age, that we are entering an age where people who have been directly connected to it or witnessed it or survivors, etc., are kind of passing away. And we are entering this post-witness age, as you said. And in that context, what is the significance of, the representation of these atrocities in the museum, in the form of a museum? Can you enlighten us a little bit on that, please?
Yes, so obviously not everyone, well, very few people really generally will go to a place like the Auschwitz Museum with a survivor. Those of us who have been privileged enough to listen to and work with and even become friends with survivors of places like Auschwitz, you always have their story and their testimonies in your head as you visit these places. But for those who, in let's say 20 years, who unfortunately won't have had that opportunity, it will be really important for them to visit these kinds of places to at least get some understanding of what took place. And, in the case of Auschwitz, particularly Auschwitz-Birkenau, the scale of the atrocities that took place, as I say, it really is as far as the eye can see when you first enter the grounds in Birkenau. And I think not just in a kind of post-witness age, but in our digital age now, I think it's even more important to have these places preserved and to take people there, because unfortunately we do have people that will deny it, that will say it never happened, it didn't take place. Places like the Auschwitz Museum stand as physical evidence to the things that happened. And we see, so recording this in mid-October, and only last week, unfortunately, someone went to the museum in the morning and scrawled, sort of spray painted some anti-Semitic and Holocaust denying slogans on some of the barracks in Birkenau. And they're obviously at the moment trying to get to the bottom of how this happened and who was responsible. But again, it's just an example of the beliefs, the ideologies that are still out there. We know for a fact that anti-Semitism didn't disappear with the Nazis or the Holocaust, and so I think it's one of the real crucial elements, not just in terms of general education, but actually to serve as evidence to disprove these crazy theories that people have about the Holocaust not happening, that there were no gas chambers. We see them, we see the remains of them, and this is really important to teach future generations about as well. Yeah.
I mean, so the idea of the museum being there to take people is one way, and the other way, that as you know, our exhibition is about one of such, where through photographs, Sudeesh is taking Auschwitz to India, right, and to Kerala. So as I discovered, one of the motivations of Sudeesh was that how he felt the atrocities as connected to his present and not of a remote past in a distant place. And as we highlight, the way Sudeesh is shocked by how far things can go from the current climate of hate, racism, othering, propaganda, and divide and rule that we see rising around the world. So that don't you think there is more reason to photograph Auschwitz, more and more now, right?
Well, I must say I was surprised, but pleasantly surprised, when you contacted me to say there's an exhibition happening in India about photography at the Auschwitz Museum, because admittedly, even to me, that's not usually something that I would consider. I think, as we talked about before, that the history of the Holocaust is often just considered in a European context, or maybe sort of Europe and North America. And I will admit to knowing very little about any kind of Holocaust education in kind of in Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on. So it's great to have that outlook. But this is it. I think the history of the Holocaust and of genocide more widely, whether that's the Holocaust against the Jewish people, whether that's in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in Bosnia, and so on, is a global human history. And sort of somewhat related to that, people often, when I tell them what I do and what I'm interested in, people often ask me, am I Jewish? Do I have any family connections? The answer is no. And then you kind of get this, but why are you interested? Because of that, because it's a human tragedy because it was caused, as you said, by humans to other humans. And there are certainly things that we see happening, that happened then rather, that are happening now in various different contexts, not just in Europe and North America, but as you said, we've seen a rise of these really kind of hateful ideologies and governments, the kind of authoritarian right-wing governments that are on the rise. And so I think if places like the Auschwitz Museum can be used as an example, some people might argue the example of where these things can lead, then absolutely, I think it is a reason to photograph it, to visit, to tell other people about it. I think it's really important to stress as well that, you know, the Holocaust and the persecution against Jews, it didn't start with gas chambers. It didn't start with Auschwitz. Exactly. It started with words and labels and othering and small little things in society that gradually built up to something catastrophic. And so I think that's where the real, if we want to talk about lessons, then that's where the real lessons come in. It's not where these places end up, it's actually where they start, and the parallels we see. We know, for example, in China at the moment, Uyghur people that have been detained in concentration camps, and you know that the government are trying to sort of minimize and say it's not the way it is, but you know we all know what's happening in China, and still, you know, there's a great deal of indifference in the world, in society. I think, again, speaking from a British perspective, then often we seem to think about things as over there. It's happening on the other side of the world, so why does it affect me? Why does it bother me? You know, people will quite happily buy their goods from Nike or whoever is still probably using slave labor in China and not really think about the consequences. So yeah, it might sound a far-reaching example, but I do think that visiting places like the Auschwitz Museum and taking what's been learned over to all four corners of the globe is vitally important.
It's a very important point you said about the idea that when we take the story of Auschwitz to different parts of the world, what we are taking is not just what happened there, but the origins of what happened there. You know, the hate talk, the propaganda, the software of that eventually created this kind of, you know, infrastructure, and you know how it led to, and that is I think it's a very significant point you mentioned. And yeah. I mean, maybe it's also connected to this, that can you tell us a little bit more about your current work on digitization? I mean, in many ways, will it help to reach out to a wider world with a message of peace and tolerance? In some ways, you know, there should be many memorials and museums of genocide, right? Do you think like a visit to the memorial museum will have a factual impact on people? And so, you know, in many ways, could it be seen as a mode of deep education to enable peace and enable human beings to have more fruitful lives than wasted filled with emotions of hate, you know?
Yeah, so I think to sort of touch on your first point about digitization. So one of the things I've looked at more recently, particularly for my PhD thesis, was about social media, but specifically to in the context of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, because they're very, very active on social media, particularly Twitter. And I think social media often gets a bad reputation for all the harm it can cause, for the kind of leveling of everyone's opinions, whether that be hateful or you know, kind of things that look like facts when they're opinions. And you know, there's so many things we could say about the way these things need to be moderated. On the other hand, social media can be very useful as a tool of education and even of commemoration. I've seen in the last 18 months, because of the pandemic, you know, lots and lots of museums, Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum included, had to close for months at a time. And so obviously no one could visit. We were all locked down at home. How do you get these messages across? How do you still keep it, you know, relevant and keep people engaged? And social media really provided a lot of that, and they could push their educational programs and things they have online through social media. So it can certainly be used in a positive way. And you do see the engagement that they have with people on platforms like Twitter, particularly, where people are interested, where they encourage other people to follow them and learn about the history. And so for all the kind of bad, negative thoughts we have on these kind of platforms, they can definitely be useful in that regard. Obviously, the pandemic has made visiting more difficult. The museum is now open again, but the footfall is nowhere what it was. So in 2019, the museum had its highest number of visitors ever. It was about 2.3 million people for the whole year. And that's greatly diminished in the current circumstances and travel restrictions and so on. So obviously we hope in some sense that will pick up again. And definitely these places, visits to places like the Auschwitz Museum, have a significant emotive effect on people. It can be a really life-changing experience. I mean, I would say it was for me. And I've been there many, many times now, as I say, taking educational groups. I've taken my father so he could see why I'm interested in what I'm interested in, and so on. And I really do think that kind of visit can have a major impact. That obviously is quite an extreme example. People won't drop everything and dedicate their lives to this kind of education and research afterwards. But I think people who have that kind of visit, who have the opportunity, will come away in some sense with perhaps a shift in mentality. It's difficult to say. Of course, education is the key, and education has to start at home, in the classroom, but before any kind of trips to these sort of places. Because there have been projects to try and engage kind of Holocaust deniers even to visit, and they just don't, they're just so fixed in their own ideas and their beliefs, they don't see what's actually there. They see what they want to see. So it's a more of a progressive education, I would say. But nevertheless, it definitely has, for most people, will definitely have an emotional impact, and that would hopefully help them to change the way they think about things, or their outlook on the world.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so in some sense, the pandemic is one particular configuration in our reality, but in many ways, the digitization could also help taking it wider, right? Like across the world. Right now, we are taking photographs of Sudeesh to talk about this in Kerala, but a digitization could expand a much wider reach, and one can really talk about it for this notion of deep education, and the idea that people to be able to recognize the consequences of their very soft, simple actions like hate speech, othering, and so on, which at some point becomes out of control and gets into this very large level of atrocities, right? In this level. So it's, in that sense, yeah, I think it's a very important area of work that you're doing, and thank you so much for joining and enlightening us on this.
Thank you for having me. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.